Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate your time in this today. Today we will be talking about understanding the different categories of forcibly displaced people, their unequal access to the services provided in the United States, and what strategies we could develop to campaign and to advocate for our forcibly displaced people. Today we have three outstanding speakers who will take us through these categories and the advocacy and strategies to advocate about it. So first we have Balkis Mehring. She is the Senior Policy Advisor at the Refugee Advocacy Lab and Senior Policy Counsel at the International Refugee Assistance Project, IRAP. She provides strategic and technical support to the state and local partners advancing inclusive policies for refugees and other displaced people. Balkis brings over a decade of legal and public policy experience. She is the daughter of a refugee from Libya and an immigrant to the US. Thanks for joining us, Balkis. Second, we have Tobin Williamson. He is the Senior Partnership and Policy Manager at the Refugee Advocacy Lab, housed at the Refugee International. Prior to joining the lab, Tobin was the Manager of Advocacy and Policy with the Main Immigration Rights Coalition, and he brings years of experience for working in the U.S. congressional offices and consulates general. And third, we have with us, happy to have with us, Anahita Banahi. She is the Deputy Director of Refugee Affairs at the Coalition for Human Immigrant Rights, CHIRLA, where she leads campaigns advocating for the well-being of refugees and newcomers locally and nationally. Previously, she served as a refugee organizer with We Are All America, building grassroots reports, convening stakeholders, and promoting welcoming practices for refugees in California. She is herself an immigrant and the daughter of an Iranian refugees, which helped her to understand the context and to bring her unique perspective on the challenges and contributions of the new Americans. Thanks again for joining us, and I will give the floor to Balkis to kick us for the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited for this webinar and for your engagement in this. So next slide, please. For those who aren't familiar with the Refugee Advocacy Lab, it's a partnered initiative between Refugees International, IRAP, where I'm housed, and the Refugee Congress. Our work is centered in the perspective and leadership of displaced people themselves. They inform our policies and our work. And our mission is to grow the movement for U.S. leadership on welcoming refugees. And we do that through three prongs of work. We provide strategic communications, trainings, and resources. We build partnerships in the field. And finally, we champion inclusive policies. And that prong of the work is what we'll be sharing mostly today. Next slide. So just a little roadmap about today's webinar. So we'll be covering categories of forcibly displaced people. We can't possibly cover every type of status, but the focus will mostly be on humanitarian pathways and processes. We'll quickly give an overview of what ORR benefits are and who's included and who's not. We'll be covering some opportunities for advocacy on expanding those types of services at the state and local level. My colleague Tobin will be sharing some examples of inclusive policies as well as effective advocacy strategies. And Anahita will be similarly covering effective advocacy strategies that they've employed in California. And then we'll open it up to questions. We'll be sharing some additional resources. And at the end of the webinar, we'll be announcing a new upcoming the inaugural pilot of a coaching sessions that we hope to do in the fall that involve an application process, but more on that later. Next slide, please. So I thought a good place to start is to briefly, explain what we mean by forcibly displaced persons. I like to refer to Refugee Congress, RCUSA, and ECDC's Integration Outcomes Report, which acknowledges that there's more than one pathway to the U.S., and people's experiences in the U.S. are not limited to just the refugee pathway. The report highlights the integration successes and challenges of forcibly displaced people, and also challenges the simplified economic measures often used to evaluate integration outcomes and the effectiveness of resettlement programs and support services. So if you haven't given this report a read, I really encourage you to do that. But basically what we mean when we say FDP is just capturing those who are forcibly displaced and can come to the US, as asylees, SIVs, refugees, and a whole slew of other categories. I want to start by acknowledging the reality that unfortunately very few FDPs have access to support programs when they arrive, and when they do, most integration programs in the United States are short-term and very hyper-focused on helping refugees become economically sufficient as soon as possible without regard to their long-term interests. That's beginning to change. There's more recognition now that investing in services and programs that are more responsive to the needs of newcomer communities result in better outcomes for everybody. And while there's been a lot of negative rhetoric recently, given that it's an election year, we just want to remind people that the number of inclusive and pro-refugee policies have actually been increasing year over year. And states are also becoming more proactive about welcoming newcomers, and they're not just leaving it to the federal government to ensure that newcomers succeed in their new homes. They're recognizing that it's in their best interest to provide equitable access to these services, especially as states grapple with aging populations and labor shortages. Next slide, please. So to start, we'll quickly go over different categories of FDPs. And I'm sorry if this is repetitive for some of you, but we'll try to quickly explain what each one is. So we'll begin with the most commonly known one, refugee. It's someone who is outside of the United States who can prove that they were persecuted or fear persecution due to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Refugees are authorized to work upon arrival, and they must apply for a green card within a year of being in the United States. And asylee is basically the same thing, but it refers to somebody who's in the United States and claiming asylum, or at a port of entry claiming asylum. Unfortunately, that's becoming restricted now, but that's what that is. Asylum seeker, this isn't a term of art, but it's what we're going to use in this presentation to distinguish between what an asylee is. An asylee is someone who successfully granted asylum in the United States. An asylum seeker is someone with a pending application. And the asylum backlog is pretty hefty these days. It's like, I think it currently stands at over 2 million. And so asylum seekers are in the United States for years before their application is adjudicated. Next is SIVs. That generally refers to Iraqi and Afghan nationals who are employed by the U.S. government or the U.S. forces or ISAF. And there's also a separate category for interpreters. Next slide. Then there's temporary protected status and also deferred and forced departure. These are very similar, but the difference is that TPS is derived from statute, whereas DED is in the discretion of the president and comes from his constitutional power to conduct foreign relations. They're eligible for work permits. You can see on the screen the list of countries that are designated for TPS. Some of these countries have been on this list for maybe even decades now, like Somalia has been there since the 90s. So these are individuals that could be in the United States for a very long time. And DED is currently only 3 countries, Liberia, Hong Kong, and Palestine. Next slide. And then there's humanitarian parole, and that's, it hasn't been as common until recently, thanks to, Congress not passing immigration reform. This administration has increasingly relied on humanitarian parole as a humanitarian pathway to the United States. So there's currently several parole programs. Parolees are eligible for work authorization, and their period of stay is typically between 1 and 2 years. Anyone can apply for humanitarian parole, but there are some programs. Some of you might be familiar with the Afghan Nationals Humanitarian Parole Program. There's also the process for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, which is commonly referred to as CHNV. There's Uniting for Ukraine, and there's many others that aren't as commonly known, but you can look them up on USCIS's website. And of course, there's other humanitarian pathways like DACA. There's UNT visas for victims of crime and trafficking, as well as special immigrant juveniles. And so we're not presenting a fully comprehensive list of all the statuses, but these are the main humanitarian ones, but just want you to be aware that there are others. Next slide. So what benefits do FTPs receive when they arrive in the United States? So for refugees and ORR eligible populations, which I'll explain what that is shortly, are eligible for federal benefits through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So these benefits are, refugee cash assistance for those who need it for like the 8 to 12 months upon arrival, if they're not eligible for other federal means tested benefits such as TANF, they would get that. There's also RMA or refugee medical assistance. If they're not eligible for Medicaid, they would get health coverage for the first 8 months from the date of admission. There's also a big category of services that falls under Refugee Support Services or RSS. These include employment, job training, English language training courses, skills recertification, and there's several types of programs that fall under that. There's also Matching Grant, which is a program where resettlement agencies receive funding to run these programs themselves. And so they're similar to RSS services, but they're run by resettlement agencies. And they tend to, unfortunately, typically be for resettlement agency clients and not, other eligible ORR populations. There's often an issue of secondary migration. If people move, are settled and then move to another state, sometimes it's hard for them to access these services. Next slide, please. So who receives ORR benefits? It's a rather limited, we refer to these as ORR eligible populations, and it's a rather limited group. It's refugees, asylees who are granted asylum, Cuban Haitian entrants, certified victims of certified victims of trafficking, Iraqi and Afghan SIVs, and Marasians, which are very, which isn't really much of a category anymore because it's, children of US forces who fought in Vietnam, but it still occasionally comes up. Afghan humanitarian parolees, their ORR benefits expired with limited exceptions last September. So generally speaking, if they've arrived after that date, they're not eligible for ORR benefits. Ukrainian parolees are still eligible until September of this year. Survivors of torture receive different types of benefits, but they also receive some ORR benefits, not, the same as refugees. There's also unaccompanied alien children program, and it's mostly, custody arrangements that ORR pays for. Next slide. So why are some immigrants excluded from federally funded benefits? This goes back to 1996 when Congress passed welfare laws that distinguish between who a qualified and who isn't a qualified immigrant. Before then, many types of non-citizens were eligible for benefits in the US, but this was curbed significantly in 1996. And in reality, even though there was a list of qualified and unqualified immigrants, the fact of the matter is that even most qualified immigrants face a 5-year ban to any types of benefits. And so it still excluded most people with the exception of ORR eligible populations. I will flag that there's a lot of nuances to these laws. I'm just giving a very quick general overview, but many services do not qualify as benefits. And so you'll see that federal agencies sometimes don't, specify whether services are meant just for qualified or not qualified immigrants. And so the reality is that, while some federal funds are very restricted, some are not, and states can have a fair bit of latitude when they're, providing funding for these services or giving it to grantees. Next slide, please. So with these limitations in mind, how can we advocate for more equitable access? Tobin and Anahita will go into this more, but I just wanted to highlight a few key points. First, sometimes there's opportunities to push state refugee offices to request more ORR funding for needed services. And so a good starting point is to get to know your local refugee coordinator and see how those funds are being utilized and how they're being used. Offices can also be creative depending on how a state is set up. Like in Michigan, I know, for example, that they, use ORR funding and supplement it with state funding to fund positions, for example, like housing coordinators or sponsorship coordinators, where they could, can provide these services to everyone, not just ORR eligible populations. And so CHNV parolees can access those same services. Second, advocating for states to use state funding and to use state funding and also to more creatively use federal funding, FEMA funding, for example, federal funding for homeless shelters. Those types of funding don't have restrictions, and they're being used to do things. In New York, there recently was $48 million for case management and legal services for asylum seekers. And so there are other pots of money that states can utilize that, you all can advocate for to be used to serve these populations who are excluded. And Tobin will share more about this later, but where it's politically possible, of course, we should always advocate for services being provided without regard to immigration status. But of course, that's not always possible in every context and in every state and for every type of service. Next slide, please. And if there's one key takeaway before I end my remarks, if you're advocating for a policy, take the time to think about who's being included and who's being excluded. Sometimes, categories are inadvertently excluded. In Virginia, for example, we work on in-state tuition and, PPS holders are included, but parolees are not, and neither are asylum seekers. And so when you advocate for a policy and where it's politically feasible, we encourage you all to think about who's included and who's not. There's also a useful phrase that we like to use, which refers to lawfully present, which is a term of art that is used to refer to anybody who's in the country that is basically lawfully present. It means what it means. And so using that term can open it up to pretty much, a wider category. And so just be aware that that's a term that could be used and is very useful. Of course, it doesn't apply, unfortunately, to undocumented immigrants. but it's rather expensive. And unfortunately, there are different legal considerations when applying policies for undocumented. And finally, assess whether there'll be an impact on other communities and do no harm. We've faced numerous situations where legislators, try to play sides and say, well, I'll give you this, but then, we're going to strip away services for undocumented immigrants that are currently, in law or on the books. And so it's not worth it to hurt other communities so that, one community gets additional services. And so just wanted to flag that unfortunately the dynamics and the politics in a lot of states these days is that they're playing communities against each other. And so I think when you follow these principles, definitely elevate the do no harm principle. And with that, I'll hand it off to Tobin.
Thank you very much, Balkis. So yeah, my portion of the presentation today is going to be kind of taking a look at what are some examples of policies that we have seen in states that could be opportunities for advocacy that you might learn about and take away and take to your states. So here you'll see a picture of us, me and Balkis, at a conference earlier this year, along with 3 of our state leads, Darlene from Georgia, Rodrigue from Virginia, and Ramucho from Pennsylvania. So we really rely on our state leads to kind of provide the context for what's happening in the states and to kind of be those experts and have those connections that really can lead to some positive gains. And here on the side, you see a couple of examples that I'm going to go into a little bit in more detail. Things like in-state tuition, driver's licenses, healthcare access, and housing access. But these are just a few examples of areas of legislation where some advances could be made. So next slide, please.
Right, Tobin, we're getting a little bit of feedback from your mic. I'm not sure if there's an issue.
That's weird. Yeah, I don't have, I haven't changed anything from the tech check. Let me turn it off and on again real quick. All right, can you all hear me better now?
I think so,
better.
yeah.
Think so? Okay, that was weird. So yeah, we'll start by talking a little bit about in-state tuition. So for anyone that's interested, okay, good. I'm glad to see that it's better. The President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration has a really helpful portal that you can see, various policies listed state by state to see how in-state tuition bills are around the country, as does the Advocacy Lab. And so we will send those links out to everyone after the call, so you can have a look and see what's available in your state. But basically, the range on that portal ranges from categories such as comprehensive, accessible, limited, restrictive, or prohibitive, which really is kind of indicative of the spectrum for various policies, not just about in-state tuition, but the other policies that I'll talk about today as well. It really does often matter state by state, and it's obvious to most people, but what advances could be made in California aren't the same as could be made in, for example, North Carolina or Utah or Minnesota. It's really state dependent. And so that's why it's so important to have our state leads and other folks that are on the ground, people like Anahita in California, that have those sorts of connections and knowledge about what's happening in each state. But anyway, the lab has been working on this issue of in-state tuition in a lot of states, in various stages. Some, for example, were just planning what kind of legislation to introduce, planning for next session or maybe even the year after. In some states, legislation has been introduced, but it hasn't been passed yet. And in other states, it's been passed, and we've had a lot of success about expanding access to different pathways of immigrants and categories. So a few examples, in Utah, we've seen a lot of success. In Georgia, there was a really great clip of an impacted individual from, I believe, Afghanistan, speaking before the state legislature, sharing her story about how this policy impacted her. In North Carolina, we're just undertaking, some planning stages for next year. talking about who can be the potential sponsor, what kind of framing to make on the legislation, things like that. And then in Oregon, Balkis actually testified before the state legislature about some legislation that's happening there just a few weeks ago, and we shared it out on our social media if you want to see an example of our advocacy in action. So yeah, in-state tuition is a really great opportunity to expand access to this service to folks, with different backgrounds, whether it's humanitarian parolees or asylees, refugees, the categories that Balkis mentioned earlier. Overall, around half of U.S. states have some sort of in-state tuition program for immigrant students, and that number continues to rise every year. So next slide, please. The next issue area that I will speak to briefly is about driver's licenses. Around 20 states so far have passed varying degrees of this sort of legislation, where you hear about driver's licenses for all campaigns or drive safe campaigns, where basically it extends the ability to get driver's licenses to folks whether they are here without documentation, or whether they're humanitarian parolees, facing barriers about real ID restrictions. This is an issue that specifically varies quite a bit state by state, even among those 20 states that have passed it. So some recent examples that you may have heard in the news last year, HF4 was a bill passed by Minnesota's legislature. Last year, a new Rhode Island law that had passed in 2022 went into effect. And Massachusetts, the state legislature passed a law that opponents then sent to a ballot referendum question, and Massachusetts voters then passed that ballot question. And so, again, it takes different pathways to sometimes go into effect, but this just kind of shows how it varies state by state. And this also is an example of how sometimes state legislators can be more restrictive in the policies that they pass and advocate for. For example, in Indiana last year, a case went to the court system where the state legislature allowed Ukrainian humanitarian parolees to get driver's licenses, but restricted folks from other countries like Haiti and Colombia, places like that. So it's an example of how, sometimes it can be more restrictive, not just advocating for more, but sometimes state legislatures try to make it for less individuals. And if you're interested in this policy in particular, the National Immigration Law Center is a real national expert on this issue, and they have some really great resources. So next slide. A third example of inclusive policies are healthcare access. Speaking from my own personal experience, I want to reference the All Means All push in Maine. Thanks to large numbers of impacted community members doing things like showing up at the Capitol for advocacy days, writing op-eds that were placed in local newspapers, and presenting testimony to state legislators, the Maine state legislature actually expanded MaineCare health insurance access to folks regardless of their immigration status, including asylum seekers, which had been denied for years and years following a more restrictive governor's administration about 10 years ago. And then the other example for healthcare access, which Anahita will speak to more later on, is the California Medi-Cal health insurance expansion last year, in which California became the first state to provide health insurance to people without documentation. And because of this, the California Department of Healthcare Services estimates around 700,000 people will be covered that were not previously. So that just kind of shows a real world example of how many lives can be impacted when you expand inclusive policies at the state level. Next slide. And then the last example I'll point out of inclusive policies is around housing access. A couple of things to highlight here is the Denver Asylum Seeker Program that just went into effect earlier this year. It is a 6-month supportive program that provides housing stability and job readiness training for newcomers to the city. You may have seen that Denver is one of the cities in the country that have seen the largest numbers of new arrivals in the past couple of years. And this is a really innovative program led by the Denver Mayor's Office that provides stability for folks staying in housing for, I believe it's 6 months at a time, really get on their feet, get some job training, and become self-sufficient. Another really innovative example at the state level rather than local is Michigan's newcomer rental subsidy program that just passed earlier this year. It includes asylum seekers and non-ORR eligible humanitarian parolees, as well as the ORR populations that Balkis mentioned earlier. Kind of similar to the Denver program, it provides rental assistance for a set amount of time based on income eligibility. So again, folks can really get on their feet and get some support that's not provided by the federal government. And then the last example, again, I'll go back to my personal experience in Maine, talking about how there was a landmark bill that passed last year that provided $400 million in heating payment stimulus checks to Maine residents. And thanks to the continued advocacy from immigrant-led organizations, as part of that package, $21 million was included to provide housing for asylum seekers that were being housed in Portland area motels as shelters. So just continued persistence and advocacy really pays off and pays dividends sometimes. So that's kind of the takeaway lesson here. So next slide. And again, just kind of building off of that theme in terms of effective strategies for inclusive advocacy, it's so important to lift up a wide range of messengers, especially folks with lived experience. They're often the most powerful messengers. Statistics show that people that know refugees are more likely to be supportive of pro-refugee policies. Folks that have lived experience can tell their own stories. They can ground them in shared values and really connect with target audiences like state legislators. And similarly, other trusted community members that do not have experience in forced displacement, people like faith leaders, law enforcement officials, and so on, they can be powerful messengers too. They can represent maybe a familiar perspective to state legislators or city councilors that don't have that sort of background. They can also model a journey of getting to know someone, know refugees, know asylum seekers, know Ukrainians or Afghan nationals who have experienced forced displacement, and kind of share how they started to, really support those folks and advocate on their behalf. And they can also, kind of similar to the previous question or the point, they mirror and normalize the audience's or legislators' own experiences. So, they can also be powerful advocates as well. And so, next slide. And with that, here's an example in Georgia, one of the Refugee Advocacy Lab states, of an advocacy day that they held earlier this year. As you can see, dozens of folks showed up. They met with legislators. They advocated for pro-refugee policies and really made a difference there down in Atlanta and Georgia. And so with another example, I'll pass it over to Anahita and describing their work in California with Chile.
Thank you so much, Tobin. Really appreciate that. Thank you to all of you, Ali, Balkis, and Tobin, for that really important information. As Ali mentioned earlier, my name is Anahita Panahi. I'm the Deputy Director of Refugee Affairs for CHIRLA, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights. And for those of you who are maybe a little bit less familiar with CHIRLA, CHIRLA was founded in 1986 to advance the human and civil rights of immigrants and refugees. And our mission is to achieve a just society that's fully inclusive of all refugees and immigrants, regardless of status. I'm so excited to share with you all some of the effective strategies for inclusive advocacy that's worked for us here in California. And as Tobin mentioned, the political dynamic and demographics look different in each state, whether you're in a blue state, in a purple state, or in a red state. But these are inclusive advocacy efforts that could really be utilized and implemented across the country. And so I'm really excited to share with you some policies that we've worked on here in California and have been successful in doing so and passing the finish line, but wouldn't have been possible without some of the strategies to ensure that we're being inclusive and intentional in our advocacy that is inclusive of all refugees and newcomers. So one of the most important things that we have implemented here in California and strongly believe in is coalition building. We have been able to build a diverse table of stakeholders to be able to advocate and advance pro-refugee legislation and policies at the state level. And this really came about during the Trump administration in lieu of the support of the federal government. And so we came together as advocates in figuring out how can we advance these policies at the state level with the support of the governor's office and our state legislature. We found that if we bring together diverse stakeholders such as faith-based groups, comprising of Jewish groups, Muslim groups, bringing together our interests together and advocating for these pro-refugee policies, we garner more support and we build a more unified voice. We've also brought together our very local resettlement agencies such as IRC, who has actually been one of the most important partners for us in being able to advance our pro-refugee policies in California. And so that goes without saying that when we work together in these coalition spaces, we're able to create a dignified, unified voice when we're lobbying our state legislators and policymakers, and really ensuring that we're bringing our unsuspected allies and stakeholders to the table to be able to advocate for inclusive advocacy. The other thing that, of course, my colleague Tobin has touched on is grassroots support, really ensuring that we're engaging our refugees and community advocates and organizing efforts to empower them to advocate for their own rights. And so really ensuring that we are bringing them in the beginning part of the decision-making process of those policies that are going to directly impact them in our states. And so one of the things that we've utilized and host here annually in California is our Refugee Advocacy Days in the state capitol in Sacramento. We have brought forcibly displaced persons, asylum seekers, newcomers in California to meet with their legislators, provide testimony, and speak to why these pro-refugee policies are so important for their livelihoods and for them to be implemented and passed here in California. And I have met some of the most amazing folks who have felt so empowered after these advocacy days and wanting to advocate for more and wanting to do more. And so once those resources and spaces of opportunity are provided to them, I promise you that they will show up and they will show out more than we've ever I think expected ourselves. And so that's something that we really pride ourselves in, is making sure that we provide those spaces and opportunities for them, whereas otherwise it may have not been present. Next slide, please. As such, we've talked about grassroots support. I also want to talk about grass top support and why grass top support is just as important. Grass top leaders are individuals in a position of power and position of influence. This could be businesses, faith leaders, community leaders, and also potential champions in our state legislators. They typically have a sphere of influence, and if you're able to engage these leaders who are grass top leaders, essentially, they can also be able to influence their peers within their networks or within the state legislators to be able to achieve your advocacy goals. And so in organizing, which is a much longer, I think, session, we talk about power mapping and analyzing our targets, who those targets are, and how they can help achieve our advocacy goals with respect to state policy. And one of the other things I want to mention is public awareness campaigns. We, of course, develop campaigns using various media platforms to educate the public and our lawmakers about the experiences, challenges, and contributions of refugees and newcomers in our community. And one thing I want to highlight is really combating the misinformation that comes out around refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers. Many times we meet with our lawmakers who are also new in these positions and are not seasoned, right, in these issues around immigration. So it's very important as we're going into our advocacy efforts, our organizing efforts for these policies, that we're also educating our lawmakers and our communities at large who refugees are, who asylum seekers are. And I think Balkis did an amazing job in really highlighting who these displaced populations are. And a lot of times we see lawmakers with an aha moment in not knowing some of this basic information that we may think everyone knows. And so really just emphasizing the importance of education for not only our community at large, but also our grass top leaders as well. Next slide, please. Awesome. So I want to share with you all just 2 case studies that we have here in California, and how we've been able to achieve that using some of those effective strategies for inclusive advocacy that I've just shared. One of the policies that may be familiar to many folks is SAVEN, which stands for Enhanced Services Program for Asylees and Vulnerable Non-Citizens. As a coalition, we were able to draft this policy, implement it, and pass it with an $8 million budget in 2021, which aims to provide the same case management services to refugees, but now to asylees and human trafficking victims and also survivors of torture. And this is something that we wanted to ensure that this gap, right, in equity did not exist, and making sure that asylees and refugees are parallel in the services that they receive and when they receive it. And this SAVEN bill and budget item was able to do that in California. The program is coming to an end this summer, and we are working hard with the advocates and the state legislature to ensure that we can continue funding for this program that has served over 2,000 asylees and human trafficking victims so far in California. Next slide, please. All right, and so what are we working on today? We are working on extending case management for refugees, asylees, and all ORR populations in California. As we know, there are very inspirational models in Oregon and Colorado, in New York, where they extended case management for refugees. And we've seen evidence that shows when refugees are provided with extensive and expansive case management, they're set up to thrive and become resilient in their communities. And so we are advocating to expand that up to 1 full year of case management in California. That is under Bill SB 85. And when we talk about grassroots support and grass top support, we've not only garnered over 80 organizations across the state that have supported this initiative, we've also garnered over a dozen grass top leaders. So in other words, our state legislators that have signed on to this and support. And so far, which is really exciting, is that we have been able to get unanimous support from both chambers. And so we're at the tail end of the legislative session and we're almost there. There is a big budget attached to it, but we are fighting till the end and hoping that we can continue to advocate for inclusive policies, again, that are not leaving folks out, and being able to provide equitable services. So I hope that this is also a source of inspiration, as other states have been a source of inspiration for us, and really just understanding that dynamics in different states are different. And so sometimes we're pushing back against policies and sometimes we're pushing forward policies. But we're really in this together, and coming together as a collective for inclusive policy is really something that is quite possible, not overnight, over the years, but it's something that we really take pride in here in California. And I hope that this was fruitful to you all. Really appreciate the time here. I will now pass it back to my colleague, Ali or Balkis, I think.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anahita. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tobin, Balkis, and Anahita for this great information, and hope it is helpful to all the participants today. And now we open the floor for questions. If you have any question, raise your hand or write in the box, chat box. You are welcome. Any question?
I know there's been a question about whether the presentations will be shared out after the fact. And yes, the slides will be sent to folks that had registered in advance to attend the call today. So yes, thank you for your interest, and they will be sent out shortly.
Thank you, Tobin. Any question? I'm looking at the box.
I have a raised hand.
Yes, please go ahead. Betty, Patrick, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much for giving me this time. I'm Patrick, and I'm a refugee. I stay in Rwanda, in Africa. So I'm interested by what you are doing as activities to support refugees and asylees to see how they can increase their way of life. So, but I would like to ask a question concerning to extend the capacity building for other refugees, because I think if this can be a joint effort in terms of like implementing different policies concerning lives of refugees will be very important. Is there any way that you can also extend this way of helping refugees, not only in the US, but also in other corners of the globe? So if there is any way that you can do it in terms of capacity building, I think it will be also very important for other refugees.
Thanks for your question. Who wants to take this question? Balkis?
Sure. I mean, our presentation was mostly focused on our advocacy work in the United States. So I don't want to, pretend that I'm an expert on capacity building outside of the United States, but I do know that our organizations collectively have been doing that work. I know IRAP has been working with partners internationally to build capacity in countries with refugee-led organizations. And so we have developed partnerships there, and you can check that out on our website, refugeerights.org. I also, I know that Refugees International has been working on this and advocating. I don't want to speak for them. I don't know, Tobin or anyone else wants to speak to that, but I know that they've been pushing actual like countries to do some of the similar work that we're doing here in states. For example, allowing refugees to work in host countries. But yeah, I'll pass it to Tobin. I see him nodding his head.
Maybe I can add something before Tobin. So I am the membership manager at Refugee Congress, and we work on advocacy on the national level in the United States. And we also have a global arm or branch, ASRAP. So we are in the global network with UNHCR. We try to advocate for the refugees and forcibly displaced people globally. In the United States, we have training program, intensive training program to our community leaders. And Tobin, if you want to add anything, please.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of things. So I'm working with what's called the Refugee Advocacy Lab, which is kind of focused on U.S.-based policies in the 50 states and U.S. cities. But I'm part of a larger organization called Refugees International, and part of what RI does is really working on power shifting as a key pillar of the work and lifting up folks that are experiencing forced displacement around the world. So part of RI's larger work is very much involved with that. I know there's something called the Refugee Fellows Program that happens every year. I believe the application period for that just closed recently, but this is, I believe, the second cohort of that. So something to be watching for, going into next year. So certainly stay in touch with all of the organizations represented on this call: Refugees International, the International Refugee Assistance Project, and Refugee Congress, for ways that you can get involved even if you're outside of the U.S. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobin. Any other questions?
I see a question in the chat, and I just want to take a moment to answer it. What has been an example of an effective public awareness campaign regarding refugees and asylum seekers? So I'm going to use this opportunity to plug in our Welcoming Refugees campaign and our Let Asylum Seekers Work campaigns that are here in the US. And so if you go to welcomingrefugees2025.org, we run this campaign every couple of years, or different iterations of it every couple of years. But basically, the main goal is calling on the administration to improve refugee resettlement in the US. And we're running that campaign right now. And we're asking state and local elected leaders across the country to sign a letter in support of refugee resettlement. And a big part of this is raising awareness about refugees in the United States. And so that's an example of a public awareness campaign that we do. And it really helps build support for refugees among state and local elected leaders, and also show the administration that, look, there are people across the country who support welcoming refugees in their community. So it's a very important public awareness campaign. And then I'll turn it over to Tobin to talk about the Let Asylum Seekers work campaign.
Sure. Thank you, Balkis. So the Let Asylum Seekers Work campaign is one of our federal advocacy initiatives, where we focus really on advocating to change the U.S. policy that prohibits asylum seekers from working for 180 days after they submit their asylum application. The campaign is really rallied around a bill called the Asylum Seeker Work Authorization Act that's been introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives. And we're currently exploring ways to maybe look at administrative level advocacy as well, to get some solutions from the administration. So I'll also drop the link in the chat for that campaign as well. But those are two of our federal focused campaigns that we would love for folks to get involved with.
Thank you, Tobin. I think there is a question from Leila.
And then
we have a raised hand that's been up for a while.
Okay. Yes,
and
I
then
see the name. Yes, please go ahead. Lojoho, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate Ali. My question is straight away, like on the refugees advocacy and lab and the Refugees Congress. I'm from Colorado as a Congress associate. I would like to ask a question on how can Refugees Congress within the state expand the refugees advocacy within the policies of Refugees Congress and the policy of the Refugees Advocacy Lab. So is there any expansion of working with the other stakeholders, or we're just working as two partners? And also because I know the refugees issues are really impacting the world right now and changing the policy and narratives, because whether in the West and the global South, it is something that is really impacting the policies across the world. So how can we as a press within the state and the counties work together with other stakeholders? Is there opportunity that we can widen the net on welcoming other partners, in the refugees advocacy within the state, like Denver, so that we can work together, so that we can see how the refugees advocacy policies can be really enacted and to support the refugees policies? Thank you.
Thank you, Lojoho, so much. I mean, today is one example of our work together with the lab, with the other partners. So we are, I mean, as a Refugee Congress, we are partner in the key platforms that advocate for refugees, including Colorado and the other states. And especially in your state, we are like working on mapping the resources and expanding our outreach to all potential partners. If there is anything to add, Tobin, about the federal things we are doing, the expanding, yes.
Yeah, certainly, we're always looking for, new organizational partners to join the Refugee Advocacy Lab. I believe we are around 40 or so right now. So that's one way to join, as well as, getting involved with the Refugee Congress. I know that we have some delegates from Colorado, and my colleagues, Megan and Sheridan, are very active with something called the Refugee Storytellers Collective. And then I don't want to spill too much news, but there could be a chance for, a really cater or specific advocacy training program that we'll be offering later this year for folks. There'll be an application process for that rollout, but I believe Balkis will be sharing more about that later on. So yeah, certainly always looking for more ways to partner and to learn from each other.
Okay, thank you, Tobin. There is a question from Leila to Anahita. Can you please elaborate the concept of expanded case management a little bit? Yeah, she wants more information if you can provide.
Absolutely. Thank you for that really great question. So by expanded case management, we essentially mean extending case management. As we know, refugees are only eligible for up to 90 days of federally funded case management. After the 90-day period, refugees are sort of then left afloat, many of whom we see here in California are not having permanent housing, are not having job readiness, technical skills, are not ready to become self-sufficient in their communities. And so with the studies that we've seen that have came out of Utah with extended case management for over 2 years, is that it is really able to allow these families to become self-sufficient in their communities, contribute back to the economy more so than the 90-day period. And so our proposal is doubling the case management here in California for up to 180 days. And the most extreme cases would then be eligible for up to 365 days of case management. And so we know that the systems, the healthcare system, the education system, the workforce system can be complicated for newcomers, and realize that 90 days is just not sufficient for them to become self-sufficient. And so this really allows them to become, a family that's higher household income, fewer ER visits, according to the studies that we've reviewed through IRC, and then far higher rates of private insurance and higher rates of permanent residence. And so that's some of the reasons why we're advocating for extending case management. And we'll also see these models that also exist across Europe, actually, where they will receive 6 months or up to a year of case management. And so we're really adamant about ensuring that once the 90 days are up, they're not left afloat and they're able to continue receiving those life-changing services.
Thank you, Anahita. Thank you so much. And you have the contact details of all our amazing speakers. You can reach out to us after this. And can we go to the last slides, Megan, please? Thank you. So in addition to the advocacy and training and providing support, the lab and the partners produce many important pieces that you can get back to them, including the toolkit about mobilizing against anti-refugee and asylum legislation in the states. This is very important toolkit. And we provided last year, like we worked on a report about best practices of framing economic contributions of the refugees and immigrants in the United States. Also, this is very important tool. Another resource is building sponsorship infrastructure in the states and creating conditions for the success of the refugees when they move to the United States. And also we share the state-by-state tracker that will help all of us to track what's happening on each state. So these are some of the resources available for all of you to go back to them. Can we move to the last one, please? Okay, thank you so much. And finally, I'd like to share with you this opportunity. So today, it was a first in a series, the first in a group of training we are providing. So the next, the Refugee Congress and Refugee Lab, we are pleased to invite you to participate in coaching opportunities. So we are providing 3 sessions tailored for specific groups. So the applicants will be sorted to groups based on their interest. The application form has the key areas that could be of interest for all of you, and it was developed mostly by the refugees' inputs, including the housing, education, language barrier. When you go to the application, you will find the categories, and you can sign up for one of these groups. And the application is open from now until August 2nd. So please go ahead and apply as soon as possible. And we will give you a feedback when we will be setting up the sessions. It will be a very good opportunity tailored to support you, coach you on some specific areas of your interest. With this, I would like to thank you all. Thanks to the panelists, to the great speakers, and thank you all for attending, and keep doing the great job you are doing on advocating for the refugees and forcibly displaced people. Thank you so much and have a great day.